Great. So yeah, let's go over some of the questions that we have from the presentations to break the ice. You know that a really interesting question from Kevin Shablowski from Colorado State. Is intention to seed species in such a way as to restore biodiversity, structure, function, or instead is intention to create novel ecosystems? That's a good question. I didn't think about that before. So that's, I don't know who wants to tackle that. I think it all depends on the history of the system, but if someone wants to brainstorm about this, I think it's for sure this project, has a really strong component on restoration. So that's for sure something that, and for sure that the landscapes I was showing you on the scablands of Eastern Washington, that's, we want to really go back to the biodiversity and structure that once those ecosystems have, particularly know all the history of fire, overgrazing, climate change has led to this almost monotony of weeds. But, in systems where we have some, even, introduced grasses, do we want to create these novel ecosystems or try to go back in time, I guess, with some perennials, with some natives? And so what is the view that the group has? I don't know, Jennifer, that's a question related to your presentation. I don't know if you want to add something or start adding.
Sure. In terms of the plot studies, of course, we're keeping everything separate and distinct in the small plots so that we can look at the individual plant reactions. And I think early on we had talked about whether in the islands themselves, or at least maybe in some of the early islands, we would want to keep some of the plant material separate so that we could similarly see what was thriving and what was going out. And then also, I think we've also talked about the fact that we may want to emphasize some species and then have a group of minor components in the islands. So all sorts of interesting discussion points, but I don't think it was decided at any point whether we were trying to recreate things or whether this was more on the research side and we were trying to keep it so that we could sort things out and do some replicated studies before we made some final judgments.
Yeah, I don't know if Chris, we have any ideas on that. That the feedback I get with many producers is like sometimes those native species, given that climate change and the new assemblage of herbivores, in many cases being cattle in those landscapes, like the scablands, that's a typical example. We might probably look at more functional diversity with new species potentially than with trying to restore what was already there, that potentially that the conditions change, from climate to fire regimes to grazing. And I see that in many cases, very really difficult to turn the clock back to restoring what was already there.
Yeah, I guess I have a question. Where, this might be in the proposal, but where are you planning to put these islands? Is it in Utah? Is it in Oregon? Is it multiple states?
Well, originally for this proposal was Utah. That's the plan. And then we're expanding, for this, at least for now, is the scablands of Eastern Washington.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think sometimes restoring to historical baselines is difficult, but I also think that it would be worth thinking about and understanding what we know about what historical assemblages were in these grasslands, because I think it would be a big missed opportunity to to not try to think about these plots as contributing to restoration in some way. I think there's been a lot of interest on that idea and on using islands like this for restoration. And it might turn out that it's just not feasible because you can't get those plants established. But it definitely seems like something to think about when planting species.
Yeah, I would just, sorry, go ahead, Rick.
Oh,
Saw your hand go up.
thanks, Tim. No, I was just gonna add on there. The thing that occurs to me is, if we're going into crested wheatgrass or cheatgrass or something like that, where it is going to be, it's probably not feasible to try to go back to baseline. I think functional makes all the sense in the world. Maybe with an example like Eric used, where they were trying to create islands of forbs in more of a native sagebrush community or something like that. There it might make sense, both in terms of servicing the native pollinators, the native bees, as well as the native wildlife. It might be smart to use more native, trying to add some native forbs in as well. Because it seems like I read recently that some of the native pollinators tend to go to the plants that they evolved with, whereas some of the alfalfas and sainfoins and whatnot are more attractive to European honeybees.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll just say to that point, like, I think it kind of depends on your study area. I mean, Utah is going to be a lot different than the scablands of Eastern Washington, where, I know from experience that, the problematic thing that you're going to have there is medusa head. And there's a lot of research with, tall crested wheat, bunchgrass species being dispersal limiters and things like that. So that might be an important aspect to include into some of these plots or some of these non-native things for the function of keeping out invasives.
That's right. Yeah.
I'll just say one more thing. I know Beth Ledger at UNR has a lot of work looking at native plants for vegetation in some of these areas, and thinks about how using those plants maybe has been understudied a little bit. And so her work might be informative for some of these questions.
So who's that?
Yeah, Elizabeth Ledger.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
GER, yeah, University of Reno. Focuses on grasses. I don't think she's done much with forbs.
This is Emily in Colorado, and I was just going to mention that I'm working on a project that's looking at dryland restoration, and it's a project that USGS and Flagstaff has started. And so we're looking at the mechanisms for establishment of different native plants and looking at both grasses and forbs. But I wonder if there's a way to use the knowledge that we're starting to collect, or the knowledge that they've already collected, and kind of building on these ideas of, we're looking at, if you are trying to establish natives, it's extremely hard, like everybody's talking about. But then what plant communities are going to change based on kind of climatic changes that are happening? So, when storing lands, like people are saying, are you going back to what was there, or are different things going to be successful in the future? But I can drop a link to that project in the chat.
No, that'll be great, Emily. Yeah, that's great point, and that's the big question, right? Yeah, so it's calling like, well, functional, so anything that is functional, or species, and in the way I was thinking this also is like how these species complement with the vegetation that is provided by already in the range, so with grasses, and so how can we create synergisms, complementarities that these species in the islands actually enhance the utilization of the nutrition and the medicinal properties that to the animal, right? That's So yes, a lot of, and then the diversity, you know, that one of the topics that we didn't mention is like having those islands provide patches within those islands, so that a diversity of species, not necessarily intermixed, but in strips or patches, such that the animals, you know, can select, and there's no plant or try to minimize plant competition, so that and maybe some species being more successful than others on that patch, you know, from having that patch seeded into rows, or as opposed to just everything in a nice finely grained mix. So that's another question. And also, what is the spatial arrangement of these species within those islands? And I think that's another big question, from the animal response to all these other things.
Juan, I'll just, this is Elena. Hey, I hadn't introduced myself. I work for Juan at the university, and also do the Savory Institute's ecological outcome verification. And so for that monitoring protocol, it's always compared to a reference in the ecoregion. And so maybe seeing a reference site close to wherever your sites are that would be of a similar habitat could be a possibility, if that's not something already discussed or already integrated into some protocols. And then looking at how it's affecting the functional groups. I think the functional groups are a really important component to make sure to address.
So you mean controls, having some control sites, reference sites where?
Yeah, they might not necessarily be your sites, or they could just be treated the same, but be very good examples in the area.
Okay, so going into, yeah, we can address that. So, and I think in terms of species, I think that'd be really great to have some type of database, or if we can create some type of, yeah, I know I've been visiting with Randall Violet. They have another project working with the BLM on potentially looking at non-traditional, or even, and then also native species, restoring those in different places across the state, and also getting some seed, so that we can potentially, you know, utilize in all these other ecological sites species that you think they are maybe potentially beneficial and worth testing in these islands or in these plots first, given that the ecological conditions of those sites. So I think we might, I don't know, create like a box or a document where we can, I know Randall Violet, I don't think he's here today, he may be here tomorrow. Randall is going to provide us with some potential natives and non-natives that they are working on another restoration project. But then, you know, Chris or Taylor, if you have ideas on potential species that we can test in addition to the list that Jennifer provided, I think that'll be great, because that's something that we are looking for, you know, what is the optimal, or the species, I think that the identity that we need to put in these gardens or these plots and on these islands. So you think that's a good idea, creating some type of database? Or oh, Randall is here. Okay, so if you can comment, Randall, a little bit on what we visited last week, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Just the project that we're working with here in Cedar City, Utah, with the BLM, is they've identified using the shrub lab, Forest Service shrub lab, and also the Great Basin facility in Ephraim, Utah, to kind of come up with a forb list of primarily natives, to where we can start looking at possible propagation, and propagation on a large enough scale to where at least our local field office would have seed access, to be able to do restoration work. And they're primarily concerned behind fire. There's also a lot of massification of juniper and pinyon being done, and I guess if we would be so fortunate to be able to produce enough seed that native seed could go into some of those projects too, that'd be way neat. But the biggest concern right now is primarily behind fire. And so we're really basically kind of on a screening phase. We planted these 18 species this fall, and we'll see what happens. And ideally, you know, we're hoping that something will rise to the top, and it doesn't have, you know, 2 or 3 we would be really happy with. So I don't know, Juan, is that what you want me to summarize? Yeah. Right now, there's not a whole lot to get too excited about, because nothing has come up out of the ground yet. But
no, that's right. But that's you know, if you can create some type of working group or some type of brainstorming group where we just start visiting about these species and then potential benefits, or, you know, I talked to Randall about exchanging, you know, the species that we are using and that they are using, and then looking at that. I think that to me is something that we can, you know, enhance the capacity of this project if we start thinking more about species identity and all these issues, right, from natives to non-natives, and then from their chemistries, capacity, resiliency, capacity to establish and persist and all that. So I think that could benefit not only this project, but different types of projects. Yeah, and I'm getting, great. There's a lot of questions and comments coming from in the chat that, you know, all this is going to be recorded, right? And then we'll create like a document, you know, with all this information that is coming up. I'm trying to summarize this in this what we are talking on this, which is already recorded, but then we'll put this into a document so that everything's we can, you know, if we want to go back and check on this, we'll have the document available for that. So Taylor says here that planting of more functional species is a preference of most landowners I work with or others who might invest in the idea of incorporating islands of nutrition opportunities. Yes, that's also the feedback I have, you know, that's something that is functional to the landscape essentially, right? So that's something to consider. But I think it's also true what Chris mentioned, that is maybe a lost opportunity if we don't also explore what the history of that particular landscape or ecosite, and because those species were on the first place there for some reason, so that that could be an opportunity also to explore. But I am also open to welcome new and non-traditional species. I guess that's.
And Juan, I do have both those lists now because you sent me the list, and then I've got the list from BLM. So I'll forward that list on to you. I have not had a chance to cross-reference those at all. But anyway,
We'll do, yeah, perfect.
I can get you that stuff. And then the other thing that's really interesting is we've got a project that's I think going to coincide with this project really well. And I talked to Juan about it as well. And that's a sheep grazing project up on Cedar Mountain with the Cedar Mountain Initiative. Being the Iron County Extension faculty, I'm also in charge of the Cedar Mountain Initiative, which is the state appropriated funds to do aspen and grazing research on Cedar Mountain. And Chad Page, the new ruminant, small ruminant animal specialist at USU, has submitted and been awarded a project to look at mineral supplementation using basically a grow safe mineral depositor. It's a trailer, and we'll have ear tags in the animals, and they'll be given in some sheep, and they'll be given a prescribed amount of mineral supplement. And I think that will be really neat. And we're also going to put collars on some of these sheep too, so that we can see where those sheep disperse themselves across the landscape. And then kind of coupling that, Southern Utah University, that owns mountain property on Cedar Mountain, is really interested in doing some interseeding with sandfoin. And so I was really neat to see the sandfoin work that's been done. I've got quite a bit of sandfoin background when I was with University of Wyoming. In fact, the Delaney and the Shoshone varieties were both released from University of Wyoming. We did quite a bit of work with them. So anyway, so a lot of these things that's happening down here in Southern Utah are going to really dovetail really nice into this project.
Great. Yeah, we'll visit for sure more about this. And that's another, moving into from species now to the management. I have a question here or a comment from Kathy both. The grazing management portion, and that's some of the food for thought questions I have in terms of how to move, time to move cows, and then using these vegetation goals for the islands to decide when it's time to move. I think that's something that another big question, that in terms of these islands, trying to keep them functional and, without having all the time in the world to give them time to establish and develop a really nice root system. We might have to start grazing them earlier than what ideally may need to do it. But those rotations, and I think I visited also with Matt. I don't know if you want to comment, Matt, anything on that, but so maybe those, and I think that's exactly, you're on the spot, right? So I think that the conditions of those islands may be the deciding factor of when to move those cows from those paddocks. I think that's the concern, how one of the things that we also visited with Randall is this idea of that they do with aspen, which is trying to saturate the wildlife by burning a lot of aspen. So then you essentially saturate the capacity of the wildlife to concentrate on a particular burn site. And so that may be one, but of course that entails cost and, having islands in a way that, you saturate the capacity of the animal to really overgraze or pound one particular location. using this Aspen dilution effect that they do with the burning. But rotations for sure is a tool that we also discussed, fencing potentially those islands. But if I had to bet that more frequent rotations, I don't know if you have any insights or more comments on that, or you, Kathy, I don't know if you have any more insights that you made a question in terms of management of animals when you are dealing with these resources that may be like limited in time.
Yeah, Juan, this might kind of sound silly, but we don't really know how long the cattle will want to graze on one of these islands. And, you've got all of the nutritional data and how animals will decide what to eat based on nutritional value and things like that. But another thing that I've been reading a lot about lately is prairie dog colonies, and how the fact that the prairie dogs graze and create green ups all the time, that cattle are spending more time there. So I was wondering if maybe I could look back through some of the papers that I've been reading on animal use of these green areas, which are, kind of like your islands, much more nutritious and things like that. And if that might help give you some ideas about how much time animals would spend there and what you can expect from animal behavior. And I don't know if that's, I know it sounds kind of silly when I say it out loud like that, but
no, those are the grazing lawns, right? So that.
Yeah, exactly. They make grazing lawns, and then the cattle spend a lot of time there, and they move out, and they have like maps and everything showing how much time they spend in the green area, and then how much time they spend moving around, and what times of year and stuff like that. And I thought that might help you as you're thinking about, the size of the island and how long they might decide to hang out there and those kinds of things. So I can send that to you. It'll take me a little bit to pull it all back out, but I'll find it for you and send that along.
That'd be great. Yeah.
All right.
So
I'm going mute again.
So
This is Travis Moat. Go ahead, Eric.
oh, sorry, Travis. Juan, I was going to suggest that also, similar to what Kathy mentioned, the patch burn grazing literature, what it basically suggests is they will remain on the current patch until a new patch is burned. So it's a similar situation in that you burn, portions of a landscape, all over landscape. Animals are attracted to those new burns. Then as another patch is burned, then they'll move on to that new burn as forage is depleted at the current site that they're spending their time. So they usually do this in years, year 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. So that's another place we can look for that. And I think we've talked about that once before, Juan, that this is somewhat analogous to that patch burn grazing system, because you're creating a nutrient dense patch on a landscape that animals then will flow to.
Yeah, that parallel with patch grazing is something that we really need to. Yeah.
Well, just something I've thought about as I've been listening to the overall discussion and some of the presentations. We're talking about planting nutrient-rich vegetation in the areas, the moist areas where it would most likely grow, and we're going to it appears we're going to recreate riparian areas in a way, and I think there needs to be some thought in how we distribute those livestock, across the landscape, because we may be sinking them in the bottoms, and range managers for years have been trying to push them up the slopes. And so there probably needs to be some thought in how that distribution is going to be affected by the plant species and the locations that are selected.
So you're thinking, Travis, more frequent rotations, so increase the movement of those animals across those those plots?
Yeah, and if you look in the Intermountain West, I mean, we're basically basins and ranges, you know. And so we've spent a lot of effort putting mineral and pipelines and stuff up on the slopes to get the cows out of the bottoms so that we get a more uniform distribution of livestock across the landscape, which, you know, provides more forage, and it also helps protect some of those bottoms, especially riparian areas on public land and private land. But that's something public land managers have struggled with, and permittees also. And so I think as we're looking at this, it wouldn't hurt to also look at how we place those on the landscape to maybe help pull livestock out of the bottoms and find species in that are suitable for uplands. You know, it's a diverse landscape, and so plants seem to like to grow where there's water, but that's where we already get pretty good grazing.
Maybe I can answer that. You can exclude riparian areas from the analysis. If the pasture crosses the riparian zone, you can pull that out of the equation so that the selected areas for these islands are off the riparian zone, and in areas within the pasture that should have a little bit more moisture, so little divots or little concave areas where the moisture tends to collect more. But it should be easy to keep them out of the riparian areas as far as the analysis is concerned.
Yeah, so that's yeah, let's see other yes, it's great information on contacts for people that on plant community restoration comments, and then people that are doing restoration work. I think those are really great contacts on that. Yeah, so Rita has a question here on what cattle wants to eat and what complements what the cattle are eating as well. So the complements and what is healthy for cattle to eat in terms of yeah, that's testing this. Yeah, so essentially it's like we expect that those animals are going to probably eat quite a bit from those islands, and then they might, yeah, and I think that what Travis was mentioning in terms of the riparian area is like essentially those islands representing in some way like a surrogate for a riparian area, right? Something like that. It's like, and then we're getting, well, of course, for one, we'll be modifying the distribution of those animals in the landscape. But yeah, that's going to be the challenge, where to locate those islands relative to what the animals already have, such that the animal distribution is enhanced as opposed to get concentrated on a, say, in a riparian area or some other areas where the animals really want to hang out based on biomass availability or familiarity or whatever, that they tend to be in those particular areas. So that's something that is worth yeah, exploring, and maybe, you know, having those islands on different types of different, not necessarily all uniform, but different in terms of the species composition, and I don't know, that, or levels of utilization that can be applied, like Kathy was mentioning, on the level that these islands are being grazed, and maybe through rotations. So yeah, any other questions or comments you had from these different talks, in addition to animal distribution or species identity? I don't know. So anything related to what the idea that has on how to distribute those islands in the landscape, beyond what we already talked, like moisture and then you also mentioned elevation, and so there's other. It's not just history, right, in terms of greenness, but you mentioned other characteristics of the landscape, right, in addition to greenness. It's gone.
So on the landscape, even going back to Travis's comment, I think something that's novel about this approach is it's kind of flipping cattle distribution on its ear a little bit, in that we've spent quite a bit of time over the last several decades trying to make cattle distribution uniform.
Yeah.
But at the same time, recognizing this approach, which again, if you get into that patch burn grazing literature, it causes animals to move across the landscape because of the nutrition driving their distributions, meaning they'll move to those areas of higher that have a more nutrient dense vegetation. So I think you can kind of think about it as the inverse, is using, plots similar to this to actually move, or like in the patch burn grazing literature, they showed those, moving those burned patches around the landscape actually move bison and cattle around the landscape. And so I think it's a novel way, or a different way than we've typically thought about distribution, and that potentially there's the opportunity to use these patches to move animals, which means they have to move. They can't just stay there, because that would become problematic in its own right. So I think it's all about kind of using that post-ingestive feedback, if you will, to move animals on a landscape scale.
And then, yeah, linking what Rick was mentioning, in terms of resting. So you think, and then the parallel with patch burning, you think that using that parallel of potentially having paddocks with where they have different rest periods, like those islands, being rested, some for, maybe, even more than a year, and then some others maybe being utilized in the late summer. So having islands with different types of periods of rest, I guess, across time, that you can create a patchwork of paddocks with the islands that have different histories of grazing. So I think that may be the parallel, right, with the patch burning, right? So you have patches of different times since the last fire.
Yeah, and even in the original proposal, Juan would talk a lot about the timing at which those 4 islands or patches would be made available, at times when the rest of the vegetation would be deficient. So in the Great Basin, that's typically late summer, early fall, is when nutritionally most of your, most of the landscape would be somewhat deficient in the protein and other nutrients that it would be providing. That would be the key time when animals would be most attracted to those island systems.
Yeah. And potentially using different periods of rest and then grazing those at different times of the year, getting that like a patchwork of different types of those islands where the animals may be attracted in a different way. I think that's something that is worth considering. I think, Eric, there's another comment there from Caitlin, on insects. I think Caitlin, are you here, or you had that question on how to measure insects on those islands? And
can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I had a question about whether or not you were thinking about using this, I guess for Eric, whether or not you were thinking about using bioindicator taxa like ants and carabids for the ground insect work. And then if you were going to do that, you'd probably need some pitfall traps for those. And then I was
So-
also thinking about how you're going to survey the pollinators in particular, because sweep nets and vacuums aren't standard, I don't think.
No, and this is not my area of expertise by a long shot. So in the past, we've done some insert work related to sage grouse. We did use pitfall traps for those taxa that were, well, it'd be the genus that were most commonly used by sage grouse. But you'll have to email Dr. Dahlgren. I'm not gonna. And the pollinators were not to be surveyed with sweep nets and vacuums. That was for the ground dwelling insects. The pollinators would be used or be surveyed using other methods. Again, that's outside of my, sorry, I just can't answer that question.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, I think I remember him saying something about using some citizen science approaches. And so that would be a way that we could connect with the student education going on at the schools.
Sure.
No, Caitlin, we need to have you in contact with Dave, and as we've been discussing, trying to that is going to be a great opportunity to integrate education with the research and extension component. So that one of those loops that I was mentioning, I think that I can see fairly easy to be integrated with the insect type of insect perspective. I think that will be one of the links that will try to keep all this integrated.
Yeah,
and that's
great.
Yeah, so we'll do that for sure. And then Taylor, if you can mention, you have a comment here that I think would be great if you can share with the audience in terms of that also relates to rotations, and how we achieve a system that maybe custom made for these islands. Go ahead, if you can bring your.
Juan, I was just thinking about just in seeing some of these islands or the ideas or thoughts of them, in some of our first efforts that we have in poorer grazing systems, we always have more weeds. Sometimes weeds are similar to some of the forbs that we're talking about, trying to incorporate into the mix. Some of the more nutritious, palatable forbs, the things that we want to have, I think will sure benefit a lot better if we're starting some of the tests that we're thinking of doing in rotation systems or better grazing management systems that we've already worked a lot on, whether they be on public or private lands. I'm just thinking of how to incorporate this and make the best success with it first. And I know that we haven't exactly set up a specific design, but looking at wanting to think about the long-term success of incorporating islands, it seems like we want to start with the successful area as well, and not try to start with the worst first. And because we will have a lot of trouble with weeds or poor grazing management. And anyway, I maybe more or less just thinking out loud. I don't know if it was too profound of a comment, but I'm just sitting here thinking about areas that I'm working with and how it would be best served to start out.
Yeah, for sure. I think for a system like this to work, I think that'll be nice when we get the Stephen and then the economics component on this, but to me, rotations are going to be the key, and maybe rotations that may entail way more frequent movements than what people typically do on rangelands. We just propose a month moves, but I think maybe doing like a dynamic and feedback type of assessing and responding, like these dynamic systems where we just look at the condition of those islands and then plan the moves based on that, and maybe even way more frequent than what people, but frequent rotations are becoming more and more common, right? So people are trying to manipulate and rotate animals way more frequently than they used to. So that's something that, and then of course we need to look at the economics and all this, and the potential, or herding or, rotating animals in different ways, but looking at the economics of that, I think that the frequency of these movements to me will be one significant tool to keep those species in place for more than 1 year, hopefully.
Well, I was thinking also about Travis Moat's comment and how we could try to distribute grazing using better nutritional islands. And it got me thinking back about a time when I was working on GPS cow collar information that we had and collars that were on Deseret south of us were, we had Bill Hopkin in the office, and he could see places that he had chemically treated with spike multiple years ago, almost 20 years since the time that we had cow collars back on. And it's not real noticeable to the naked eye, but he knew exactly where chemical was spread. And it was interesting knowing that cattle were still targeting those areas that were away from riparian to go and get after the better grasses that were incorporated after the treatment happened. And anyway, I was thinking that I think we probably will have more success than we realized, just thinking about some anecdotal data that we've just come across. It hasn't been any peer-reviewed research, but just seeing what we've known to have been done in the past and the success that we've seen. It was encouraging thinking, and hopefully if we can make this work, it could be a good success.
That's right. That's the good part is we still have some time, before we deploy those islands and do the grazing. It's going to be a little bit, we have at least 1 more year to think about as we test, all the species, look at, the modeling component that Pablo mentioned, and then the in vitro system, looking at those complementarities. So there's going to be some time, some delay between, but at the same time, it's going to be good to think about all these components, for getting ready for the final test, which is going to be like the moving this into reality. I think that's that will give us some time, even next year when we meet again, trying to refine and think more about all these issues,
Juan, the thing that was concerning me was hearing the number of different rotations. If you're doing something substantially different from your control or what people want to do normally, and I hear the comment that there's more rotational, more effort in that, so maybe it's less of a big deal. But from an economic standpoint, small steps, please, not.
Well, I think that's for the experimental side. I think you're exactly right. We need to rotate. The rotations need to, on the control sites, they need to be, in parallel with the rotations done in the treatment sites. That's what. But do you mean in terms of cost or
just in terms of having something that's not dramatically different from what producers really have the labor or availability to be able to do. I mean, if your recommendations are dramatically different from if they want to adopt this, if your recommendations are dramatically different, then they have to adopt it wholeheartedly. They can't try it out on a quarter of the animals or something like that and see if it'll work. It's I would really recommend some very hard thinking about kind of the underlying science behind how to pull this off and make just a few steps away from what is commercially useful at this stage, or commercially what people are comfortable doing, what they have the labor availability to actually pull off.
That's a good point. Yeah, because that's already seeding those islands is going to be a big stretch.
Yeah, and I was concerned when I heard you say you might need to do it every other year. That's
right. So
that really changes some of the partial budgeting. That's pretty straightforward.
So you think that just like a rough estimate, in order for this to be profitable, so how often you think that has to be, like at least 3 or 4 years, right? Before you
I think maybe some of the I would think 3 or 4 years. And the other thing that's potentially very interesting is what kind of delays in establishment. You may, I thought I heard you say maybe more than a year's of rest, but get things up and going and then let it rest for 2 years. And of course it's going to depend on your rainfall and weather conditions. But don't forget, it also depends on market conditions. If you miss out on 2 to 3 good years of market, then that can really create a perception that it doesn't work.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That's and I think that's a really big challenge. Because and we had some experience, on restoration on the scablands actually in Washington, and the issue is that people tend to want to graze those improved pastures way earlier than they should, and then in many of the failures that happen in those restoration efforts is like those seeded pastures were grazed too soon. That's another.
And they look for better than anything else than was around there, and therefore they were used and very likely used inappropriately. I mean, I've seen plenty of overgrazed pasture in eastern Colorado, and I hear you when you say that there needs to be a bit of a rest, but it's very interesting to hear all the potential subtleties of how actually the plant biology plays out. How do you get this thing to really work? But I would from my very narrow economics perspective, functionality would seem to be very important to limit some of the choices to what are not what are just small steps away from what is largely being done now.
Yeah, those are really good points.
Hey, Juan, one of the things you might think about, what we used to do at Deseret when we were playing around with plantings was, I think we finally came to the point where we said, okay, once the plant gets to a certain sort of a physiological stage, then we'll be good with grazing it. And usually for us, I mean, that country, the east side of Deseret, 10 inches of rainfall. It was usually we usually didn't graze it the first growing season, but there were years where we grazed it that first dormant season because it grew so well the first year. The plants were well established, and we, once went dormant, we went ahead and grazed it. And there were a few years where you had to give it, you kind of had to give it 2 growing seasons because you were just afraid that it was so small and so poorly established that you were just gonna either pull them out of the ground or
That's right.
kill them. So somebody smarter than me might be better to set up those criteria. And when I talked about grazing and rotation, I was just thinking more or less like, almost a glorified rest rotation where you had 3 to 5, 4 to 6 pastures, and maybe you could throw one out because, and I may be wrong, but I thought that might fit reasonably well with what other producers would be doing in that kind of country. But I think it might be smart to try to pick up or try to aim for, if we're going to use some kind of an improved grazing, to aim for something that's
rest.
As other people have said, that kind of fits with the reality that people are doing.
That's right. Yeah, resting. That's a good point, Rick. Resting, and then the thing that really can work on favor of this approach is that we are aiming at late summer, early fall, so that a time of the year when that impact on these legumes may not be that harsh, relative to. I know when I was mentioning these issues at the scablands, it's like, many people wanted to just graze, in the early to or spring, spring, early summer, when those grasses were coming right up and everything looked great and green and nice. But for these particular islands, I think we can aim at the time of the year when the impact on those plants may not be that harsh, like in late summer, early fall, and then, as it's exactly right what you say, trying to rest some of those plots for the season. That will help a bunch, in terms of the persistence of those species in the landscape. Okay, so yeah, we're getting close. We are getting close to 10 when we start our new session now on extension. And I think that's, to me, that's the level of discussion, because we're already integrating all this into extension and to some extent education, with the insects. And so I think that we are doing this feedback loop, as I was showing you early in the initial slide. So now let's move to, so Seth, it's already 2:10, so we move to the extension component right now, right? We don't need to move to any other place.
Yeah. Did you want to pause the recording and start a new session for that, or do you just want to move right into it?
Yeah, let's pause and then, so we have the session separate, and then we'll. Okay, so Seth, you just pull that master plan. We are moving into the next component of the project, which is extension. And then we have Eric Thacker from Utah State giving us like an overall vision for extension on this project that the nice thing is that we already are touching on several issues on this. But let's have Eric go at it. Yeah, go ahead, Eric. Great to have you.
Thanks, Juan. Just a second, Juan, I've got. Here we are. You would think after a year and a half of doing Zoom meetings would have this down to a fine science. It's still, I'm still trying to get used to presenting on Zoom where I can't see or gauge anybody's reaction. I'm glad to be here today. I apologize that you have to listen to me twice. I'm going to give you a quick overview of kind of the extension side of this grant. And maybe for some of you kind of introduce extension a little bit and give you kind of the overall approach. I think it's important to start for those of you that are not super familiar with extension. It came about basically late 18, early 1900s to educate adult and children populations in rural counties in response to poverty, widespread poverty in rural counties. So it was basically a way of taking information from the university and extending it into rural counties, largely based around agricultural production. So my official job at Utah State University is a range extension specialist. So I'm on campus in the Wildland Resources Department, but my job is basically working with county extension agents, livestock producers, land managers, and extending science to the state of Utah and the region. So I put this model or this flow chart up just to kind of show how extension has largely functioned at a land grant institution. Historically, most of the kind of back and forth of information from, say, like rangeland user groups to the university and back has been kind of a grassroots effort. Landowners would have a particular problem. They would visit with their county extension faculty about that problem. And then that would come to the university and they would engage extension specialists and researchers to find solutions to those problems. And then there was the extension outreach of that information back to the producers. I think there's also a kind of a second route that is more associated with basic science. And I think this project is actually a pretty good example of kind of both methods. So on one hand, we're dealing with some very applicable, very applied research that may be very timely for producers that have been struggling with nutrition on rangelands or how to improve rangelands, et cetera. But on the flip side, we've got a whole other component about reducing methane, trying to mitigate certain aspects of climate change. So you're kind of getting it from the bottom up and the top down in terms of the information that will change hands both from the university to the producers and vice versa. So our approach with a lot of this is largely dependent upon county extension faculty. There's two of them on the call today, Matt Palmer, whom you'll hear from in a minute, and Randall Violet, who you've already heard from some. There will be approximately about another 10 county faculty from around the state of Utah that will be involved. When we wrote this grant, I have always tried to use basically existing programs. And so to use these grants as a way to keep existing programs going and to infuse this new information into existing programs. So I'll touch on some of those existing programs, and Matt Palmer will also talk about some of those as well. So just to give you an idea of some of the potential options for disseminating information, a lot of these are traditional approaches that extension has used over the last several decades, and then there's some newer approaches. So with this is new information, new ideas, new principles, theories come out of this project that will be directly applicable to livestock producers. We will use kind of a broad spectrum approach. In some cases, we found that fact sheets are still quite relevant, although I think our fact sheets have changed a lot. At least in my career at Utah State, my fact sheets have become much shorter, much more targeted. Very short write-ups, usually a page, 2 pages tops, with lots of pictures and graphs, and even quite a bit of bulleted text. A lot of those are often shared digitally, although we still have some hard copies. And then in terms of utilization of internships and graduate students, I've also identified some of these approaches that we will be using or hoping to engage both undergraduate and graduate students in part of this. Presentations, and this has been challenging during COVID with extension. I think has fundamentally changed because of COVID. Traditionally, a lot of our extension work was done face-to-face. Because of COVID, we've become much more comfortable using platforms such as Zoom or even videos to share some of that information. And so obviously we will continue to do that. However, that all being said, I think there's still a tremendous amount of value in the face-to-face interaction between individuals from the university, whether that's researchers or extension faculty, interacting with landowners on the ground. I think it helps foster a relationship of trust, which is essential from a producer standpoint, for them to gain trust in the information that's being presented to them and having some confidence in using that going forward. Now, there's a couple of these that I think there will be some discussion afterwards as to whether we try to create standalone websites specifically for the extension component of the Smartscapes. This is an interesting project because there's so many moving parts. And so I think one of the biggest challenges is coordinating, the research, the extension, and the education components together, and then trying to figure out whether this is best captured under one large umbrella website or whether it's better off being formed out into individual websites. We're redoing the USU Rangelands website right now. I've got an individual working on that, and so we're updating a lot of that. So hopefully we'll be able to incorporate some of the results from this and that into that website as well. Social media, very similar. We've already got some existing outlets for this through the USU Extension Range Facebook page and others that are associated with USU Extension. But I think part of our discussion later today is to whether there's a need for standalone Facebook pages, et cetera, specific for the Smartscapes, or is it more efficient for time to deliver a lot of that content through existing pages that already have a following, already have kind of a track record that we can build off of. I think that's the hardest thing sometimes with extension programming, is getting things up and going and getting them started. And then something that we've utilized more during COVID than we had previously is podcasts. So the Beef Educators, we do a series of podcasts where we've done everything from highlight producers to introducing new research that's come out that's relevant for beef producers. So there's a myriad of different outlets to disseminate the information from the research that's being conducted here from the research team to livestock producers and land managers in the state and around the region. So just to highlight a couple of our existing programs that we will use, and then Matt Palmer will talk about some of our grazing schools specifically. We have a couple of programs that we implement around the state. So the first Arizona Strip Range Livestock Workshop and Tour. This is an extension program that's been in existence for 45 years, which is a very long time for an extension program. I think it speaks to its importance in Southern Utah. So obviously it started a long time before my career at Utah State started. I think one of the benefits is annually we get about 300 producers and land managers that attend that workshop on a regular basis, on an annual basis. And so using the existing programs like the Arizona Strip workshop allows us to reach a bunch of producers because we're using established programs to then disseminate this information. And we can do this both through presentations and then also visits potentially to field sites and some demonstration sites, which we'll talk about a little later. So another one is the Central Utah Grazing Expo. You're starting to see a theme. These are kind of regional programs around the state of Utah that reach specifically to producers and land managers. One of the important interactions here is to get land managers in Utah. It's primarily BLM Forest Service in the same room with producers. Number one, they hear the same science, they hear the same messages. It creates some peer-to-peer learning there. And then it also helps facilitating making changes in management on public lands. So this workshop has been going on. I can see I've got some verbiage mixed up from the last two. We've had it on the ground for 5 years. We're not reaching as many as the Arizona Strip meeting yet. We're reaching about 100 producers annually. But this is another program that we'll look to integrate. And then the last is the beef educators. So this is a county-based program that we do anywhere from 6 to 10 counties annually. We kind of rotate around the state. We've also, again, largely because of COVID, started to live stream and record a lot of these. So it's interesting how that works in our favor. You might only have 20 or 30 people in the room when you give the presentation, but some of our recorded or live streamed events have received, or we've had hundreds of people watch it. So it's an easy way to kind of maximize your reach by posting some of those presentations to social media and other places to extend the reach of those programs around the state. So this kind of gives you a snapshot of the broader overall approach that the extension team will be taking, and there will be some integration between Stephen and others. Not all of the extension team is here at Utah State. And then with that, I will take any questions. I'll stop sharing, Juan, so you can take over.
Sure. Yeah, any questions, comments, or we leave it for the open floor?
So this is a Hui Wang, and for this project particularly, are we looking at the audience for the what you Eric, you just presented for the adults farmer, or is there any particularly like a youth, you know, like for this project, and that we were hoping to reach for as well?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I think that's the one place that we haven't connected all of the dots. When the proposal was written, it was written with extension and then the education component targeting youth education. With 4-H within extension, I think there's a lot of opportunity to carry some of that, those educational programs from the education team into extension through the 4-H program. And Matt Palmer and Randall would both be good ones to answer any questions about that. But I do think that's a potential place for the education team and the extension team to kind of overlap. Kathy and I have had some conversations already. Some of the areas that they're talking about, these common gardens, which I'm sure you'll hear about later, occurring in counties where we have some county agents with expertise specific to insects and horticulture that I think could really help complement the education side of all of this.
Sounds good, thank you.
Great. Okay, so yeah, there's more questions coming up, and then we'll copy them and start going into the open floor for extension. And now let's move on the sequence to Matt Palmer, also from USU, and he's going to talk about grazing schools. Yeah, so this is the next piece of the puzzle. Yeah, Matt, take it over. Yeah.
Yes, I'd like to take, I'm not able to share my screen. It says if he could give me a screen sharing, that'd help.
Yes, Seth, maybe making Matt a co-host for sharing the screen.
And while they're doing it, I can just give a little bit of background. I'm extension faculty in Central Utah. I've been in extension for 21 years. Okay, now I've got screen sharing, I think. Can you see my screen now?
Yeah, I can see this. At least
okay.
Everybody can see. Yeah.
Okay, great. And I've been working in extension, doing horticulture programs, agriculture programs, 4-H youth programs. So in a small county, we do a little bit of everything, and it's fun, but sometimes crazy. But I've really enjoyed working in the grazing side of things. And the project I'm going to kind of show you and how we think we'll integrate into this research is our Sustainable Grazing Institute. Now, this is a collaborative effort from a lot of faculty in Extension, including Eric Thacker and many others that we've been working on for several years. And what we've noticed as you go out throughout our communities, and I heard a lot of people talking a little bit about some of the issues we see on our grazing lands. And some of them will be more like on this left picture, where we've allowed the animals to be on a certain pasture for too long, haven't allowed a rest, and that has contributed to a deterioration of that resource and the natural resources. The water's running across instead of soaking in anywhere. There's a lot of issues there, and we're realizing that many of our traditional ranches don't have the knowledge base and the ability to change. And so we really started looking at a way to change our management. The picture on the right you see is a pasture, lush and green on the left, and on the right, kind of a traditional what you would see in this area. We have a lot of sheep grazing in this area that have grazed for hundreds of years and really didn't allow a lot of rest. And so these pastures have deteriorated quite a bit, and they're not as functional and productive as they could be. And the interesting part about this picture is this is the same day, just the soils are the same. The water from the snow melt and rainfall is the same. The only difference is management right next to each other. So we started looking at this. We thought we really need to be able to get the education into the hands of those who could really benefit from this. We needed a hands-on educational program. I think over my career, I've learned that if you put a PowerPoint on, turn down the lights and lecture for hours on end, what they actually retain and take home to the ranch is very little. But if we change that and get them hands-on interacting, all of a sudden, that knowledge base does reside with them, and they take that home and are able to implement it. And so as we got looking around, how are we going to create this grazing institute where we can teach this hands-on way of managing our pasture situation? And we found the Idaho has a really good grazing school called the Lost River Grazing School. And I attended that school, found it to be one of the best in the area. And we got a grant to bring that to Utah and learn from them, and then developed a Utah-based program. And out of that, the main objectives of this is to improve grazing practices and develop sustainable forage resources for Utah. That's our basis, what we really want to do. And how we're going to do that is basically create an annual hands-on workshop and to teach the art and science of grazing management, pasture management. And what we find is, that there's a lot of science that we can teach them, but we also need to teach them the hands-on art. That's what I call it, the art, applying that science to the ground, to their lands. And so we needed this balance between the science and the art. And that's what we try to create with this workshop. In the program, we incorporate indoor classroom setting where we do some PowerPoints and some scientific understanding there, do some field exercises, and then we really key on the hands-on learning activities and they learn from their successes and failures out on the land. The course, kind of a course summary. We have some grazing challenges, and these grazing challenges are designed with animals. So we divide the class. We can only house about 20 to 25 in the program, students in the program, and then we divide them into 5 or 10, 5 to 6 people in each group, and they are given a set of animals, cattle or sheep or both. We've even had horses. And we ask them to feed the animals for a day. And so that's their first assignment. We give them the electric fences, we give them a water system, and they have to decide how much area that those animals need to be properly fed for a day. And then the next day we come back and evaluate that. How did they do? And the next day we want to ask them, okay, now you figured that out. Let's figure out how to graze to 50% utilization. And then we do a stubble height, graze to a stubble height. So each day they're participating in this grazing exercise or challenge. And then we have field exercises where we troubleshoot electric fence issues, water system issues. We do classroom instruction. We teach them about management, intensive grazing, forage growth and development, and proper grazing principles. And then we have actually incorporated a little bit of taste testing. We have meals together and we do some taste testing of grass-fed versus conventional fed beef to showcase the differences there. In the Sustainable Grazing Institute, we've trained 73 ag professionals over the years. We usually get some grant funding to offset the cost to attendees. So the full cost isn't borne by each attendee, so it's pretty minimal in cost. And we are finding we're gaining that balance. This right here, 100% of our attendees strongly agree that the pasture exercise helped them see practical applications of classroom presentations. So we're trying to find that balance between the two. We've done some surveys to see how much they are gaining from our program. We've got 26 pasture management principles we're teaching, and we're seeing significant learning, statistically significant learning in each of those areas. Here's just a couple comments from our program. They say, very pleased and happy with this conference, and we'll be back for the next one. These books are a superb resource that I plan on keeping and reviewing regularly. The next guy said, I've heard and seen people estimate tonnage on the land and estimate the amounts needed to feed cattle, but learning to calculate it on site was so awesome. Definitely something I'll use often on our operation. So we feel we're really connecting with the individuals that are able to take this home and really progress in their pasture management and grazing management on their farms. Just kind of a summary, we started in 2004. We've held the last year, we've done yearly programs, 2018, 19, and of course, 2020, instead of going online, we decided to cancel for the year because we felt it's a hands-on program. We can't adequately do it online due to the pandemic. And then we restarted this year, did another one in 2021 in Penguich. And this next year, in 2022, we plan on being in Cache County. So we're moving this around the state, trying to hit many different producers throughout Utah. I envision that the smart Foodscape information can definitely be integrated into this program we're already running, into the workshops. And if the Foodscape, we can design the plots in areas that are close to where we'll hold these workshops, and we'll be able to tour them and showcase them during our workshops. One other side note, I developed a sustainable agriculture education center where we have a 6-acre research and demonstration pasture that we do intensive grazing with grasses and legumes in a mix. And we plan on putting one of these plots next to that Sustainable Agriculture Extension Center, where we do tours regularly throughout the year, and we incorporate classwork from a local Snow College it's a state-run Snow College institution that we will teach classes there with new youth coming into their agriculture program. With that, I can open it up to any questions.
Great, Matt. Yes, great to work with you and visit your office several times. It's been great. You've been a great host and discussing great ideas every time I visited with you. So any questions or comments, or we leave it to the open floor? I think this is a great tool and a critical tool, the grazing schools, that a critical component for this project, for sure. So yeah, let's move on to now the next piece of the puzzle, that moving into adoption. And so the social part of this, so yeah, the next slide, Seth, I think that's the next. Yeah, that's it's going to be presented by Jessica Shad from also Utah State University. So yeah, I'm glad to have you, Jessica. Let's
all right.
Yeah, you're already sharing the screen, so it's perfect.
Yes, can you see my screen and the right side of it? Oh.
Yep.
Yep. Okay, great. So as Juan said, I'm Jessica Shad. I'm an associate professor of sociology here at Utah State University. I'm also the director of our Community and Natural Resource Institute, and I've newly been appointed to an extension appointment. So I'd love to talk more later on with the other people who are working in extension about how my overlap in my new position will work with this project. So sort of different from when we actually put in the proposal last year. So just a little bit more introduction of myself. I'm a rural and natural resource sociologist. I have a pretty broad research agenda, but a lot of the research that I've been doing since my postdoc at Purdue University has been focused on understanding agricultural producers and how they decide to adopt or not adopt various soil and water conservation practices. A lot of this research to date has focused more on commodity crops and predominantly in the Midwest. So while I was at Purdue, obviously in Indiana, before I came here to Utah State University, I was in South Dakota for 4 years. So a lot of my research with farmers has been in the Midwest, and it's starting to transition now more to ranching and grazing than the other types of farming I was looking at in the past. But similar sort of ideas as, you know, how can we get more producers to use these practices that are good for economics, the environment, by not, you know, regulating them, but encouraging them and learning more about what they're already doing and some of the challenges and the benefits that they perceive. I have also hired a new PhD student who will be coming this fall to work on the project with me. So Zubair Barkat, he'll be a new PhD student in the sociology program here at USU. And he has a lot of experience conducting both qualitative and quantitative research in rural places. So excited to have him working on the project with me as well. So my main goals for task 6, and these are very broad, are first just to try and understand why or why not might ranchers be willing to incorporate some of these smart foodscapes that we've been talking about today into their operation. So what might be some of the things that interest them? What might be some of the things that scare them away? How can we take that information and use it to encourage them to apply these new practices into their operations? So using some of the data that we collect in a variety of ways, perhaps develop a typology of smart foodscapes, rancher adoption types that we can use in outreach, extension, education with ranchers here in Utah, but also perhaps more broadly in the Intermountain West. And so in terms of a timeline for the research and extension that we'll be doing, so we'll be starting with doing some focus groups with ranchers this summer at those sustainable grazing institutes that you just heard Matt talk about. Hearing more a little bit about those sustainable grazing institutes, we'll probably be expanding to do focus groups or interviews with ranchers who are not just participating in those, but perhaps who are participating in some of those workshops that that Eric Thacker just talked about, so that we can get a broad swath of ranchers to talk to about, what are some of their initial thoughts on these foodscapes that we're planning. Same thing, continue to do those in 2023. And then I had planned to branch outside of those sustainable grazing institutes at that time. So our first couple of years, continuing to do these focus groups with ranchers, and like I said, interviews as well. And then we'll be starting to develop a questionnaire for a survey of producers that we'll conduct in 2025. That's a more representative sample of ranchers in the Intermountain West to understand their perceptions about smart foodscapes. And then in 2026, start to develop, and we'll be doing this along the way, but start to really finalize some of our outreach and education materials. So a little bit more in the focus groups, and this might shift as we know more about the populations that we'll be able to work with. We want to target about 40 to 50 ranchers per year to talk to, whether it's in interviews, individual interviews, or in a group setting. Try and get 7 to 10 per focus group. That's usually a good number of people to have a conversation, get going, where people feel comfortable asking questions and providing input, and where it's not too big that they feel like they can't get their voice in. We hope for these to be about 60 to 90 minutes. So perhaps after Matt does some of his field components of the grazing institutes, we can bring some of the producers back for a meal and invite them to take part in these in-depth conversations with us. As I said, during those sustainable grazing institutes, and these will focus on perceptions of the potential challenges and benefits of bringing these smart foodscapes into their operations. It'll also focus on what sort of programs, policies, or incentives, outreach might nudge them to adopt such practices. And then we'll also be talking to them, of course, getting some background information from them on their current grazing strategies and experiences. And there will be, just depending on resources and what we find with having more of these conversations with the broader team, a possibility to expand it to non-attendees, but also perhaps even non-Utah ranchers if we have the resources to do that. It sounds like we have some people in the group that are familiar with or working in Idaho and Montana, and so it might be great to bring in some of those voices as well. In terms of the survey, our goal with that is really to get a representative understanding. So not just the people who are attending these sustainable grazing institutes or who participate in workshops, but an understanding of all producers who graze in the Intermountain West. When we do these sort of surveys, it's really important to think about where we're getting our sample from. So I've done a lot of survey research with producers. Sometimes we're able to do a Freedom of Information Act request and get a list from the FSA of producers who are participating in certain programs. I've also purchased samples from private vendors. So depending on the feedback that I get from this group about the best way to capture these voices in a representative way, will be how we get our sample for doing our survey. And we'll be sending it out to about 6,000 producers in 3 states across the Intermountain West. And those sort of details can change as the project develops. How am I doing on time? So in terms of the questionnaire that we use, this will be developed through that focus group research that we do through the first couple of years. So we'll start to develop it early on and start to test it, get feedback from you all on what sort of questions should we ask that will be helpful in research, but also the extension and also the education components. So I'll talk a minute now about our survey design methods. And one of our goals with doing survey research in a particular way that I'll talk about is we really want to get a high response rate. We want to get as many people who we randomly select to participate so that we get a non-biased sample of information from producers across the region. So what the method that I'll be using for this particular project is we'll send out what we call an advance letter, where it's just sent in a small envelope where we tell producers about the study. We let them know that they can go online right away and take the survey if they'd like, but we also let them know that a mail copy of the survey will be coming to them in the next 10 days or so, and they can take a paper copy, or they can complete a paper copy if that's what they prefer to do. And I have found in a lot of my research with producers that most of them still like to fill out the paper versions. We also send with them, when we send out that second wave of contacts, we send with them a stamped return envelope. So we do all that we can to reduce any burdens that there are for them to take part in our survey. As you can see in the survey that I put over towards the left, showing that you're partnering with institutions that the ranchers respect also can help do a lot in increasing your response rate. In the past, I've also given small incentives, a $2 bill, and I've even done little experiments that show that you can get a statistically significant higher response rate by doing that. I think that the USDA must have changed some of their regulations around that, because I was told we couldn't do this for this project, but I'm still going to try and see if there's any sort of workarounds, because I've really shown that it's important and it works and it gets more people to respond. We then send out a reminder postcard to those who have not responded in the first couple of waves, and then we send another final copy of the survey with a return envelope. So we contact them up to 4 times, and this has been shown to get the best sort of response rates that you can for doing survey research today. So thank you so much for listening to my presentation. If you have any questions, my email is on this slide. Specifically today or in the future, I'll be seeking input on, what sort of types of questions should we be asking in the focus groups, but then also in the survey. If you know of different groups or individual ranchers that you think would be useful for us to interview, if you have ideas on the best sort of sampling sources that you think we should use for our survey, but then also what sort of outputs would be useful for all of you in terms of the data that we gather from the interviews and surveys. Certainly, Eric talked about a couple of them that are on my mind, and definitely we plan to produce, but I'm more than welcome to any other ideas that people have.
Yeah, thank you, Jessica. Yes, really interesting, and for sure we can add any questions. I think that's something that we need to integrate and work within this project, in terms of and the sequence, we've been presenting is perfect, from the grazing schools to the extension, and now your new role now in extension. So that's really good.
Yeah, it felt well. And I'll definitely be looking, when we start to go in, I'm not the expert on the smart foodscapes. I'm more the expert on human behavior. And so I'll really be looking for you all to, if you have certain materials that I can show the producers. It sounds like there's already some ideas for how those will be integrated in the grazing schools or in the sustainable grazing institutes. But I definitely won't be able to do it without input from everybody else.
Great. Yeah, and then for sure we can discuss this now in our open floor, for extension. So I think that's will be a really great opportunity to think about this integration and and look at for opportunities and feedback. So I don't see any questions coming up, but then we'll get all this into the open floor. We'll have an hour basically to discuss all these topics. So, and then if you bring up the new, now the new component that we are be discussing now is economics, something that I don't know much about. It's not, and then Stephen, so he's been great to visit with you and collaborate, during the proposal. I think it's been, I think this is a really critical component that we'll be discussing now. So yeah, that's Stephen, please share your screen and let's, looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Juan. So my name is Steve Kuntz. I'm faculty at Colorado State University. I'm an extension economist here. I do work in the area of livestock markets and production systems. And when you say livestock and you're in Colorado, you're talking about cattle. So we claim a lot of them, but it's primarily very much cattle focused. So what I'm interested in specifically doing on this particular project is looking at some economic issues. The project proposal itself for me is very interesting, and what I see myself and the student I bring into this project having to do is do some observation for quite a few years in the beginning. It seems to me that there's some basic science things that need to be figured out and assessed and talked about and custom discussed and figure out what directions to go. And even then, we may not learn everything we need to know there. But in the end, towards the end of the project, years 4 and 5 is where I'll be participating more actively. What I'm interested in doing is developing a pretty thorough cost benefit analysis, and primarily from a producer perspective. In my extension setting, in what I do with Colorado State University, our extension materials that are most well received and everybody that's most interested in are the budgets that we put out and some of the basic feasibility type studies or investment analysis, those types of things. But the budgets really are pretty important. And in the end, you've got to talk to producers that actually participated in attempting to do these types of things. What did you really have for cost? What type of labor requirements? What type of equipment? What type of additional management did you have to do to pull this off? And there's going to be a series of single year budgets. The startup year for sure is always different than subsequent years. So you have to split those things out and be more careful in how you elicit information out of participants. And my take here is it's not just on the producer participant side as well. The scientists that actually pull this off are going to have some ideas about what really was required to establish these islands, get them to grow. Where would we do it again? That type of thing. But in the end, we're also talking about really eventually winding out into a capital budget. This is an investment question. This is a different direction to go. Some of the things that I heard earlier today that were interesting and very curious for me is the medicinal-like properties of creating these forage systems. If it creates calves that thrive and have fewer problems downstream, that's a value if you can document you've done this, and likewise, if those animals are thriving, they certainly ought to weigh more and have higher returns that go along with them. So taking a look at how adopting this process there's year-by-year questions that you have to answer and answer reasonably thoroughly, and then put things together from an investment perspective. And then there's never one set of numbers that pretty much describes everything. You have to do some sensitivity analysis. You have to talk to a variety of different producers. For example, different altitudes or different places in the West are going to have different experiences and what happened. Could we get by with reseeding every 5th year, or did it really have to happen every 2 years? And if you're going to have to fence these things off, it's going to be it's going to hit the bottom line pretty hard. I'm also not one of those economists that believes that everything that's worth measuring is going to go in and out of a checkbook for a business. You have to talk to producers about potentially these longer term stewardship type benefits that are harder to value. I can see these islands as having an impact on wildlife opportunities, and sometimes it's hard to get producers to talk about those cash-based businesses, but it's certainly worth knowing about, even if you can't write down the details. And then likewise, I'd be surprised if we don't have some surprises and some drawbacks and basic lessons learned. Where are places that these should be done and where not? And in the end, I think this experimental process, you learn about is it going to be successful? And then you'll learn about where are some of the things that, you discover new information that people can take as useful for directions to go and directions not to go. So simply getting some management lessons and then understanding the production process is going to be relatively important. And then backing up and being able to, when you talk to producers, they want to start with a bottom line set of numbers. What are the objective dollar amounts that tend to go along with doing this type of thing? If you go down this path, are you really having to market your own beef through a grass-fed program, or are there some other alternative markets directions you can go? And are there some values here that are bigger picture and more broad, and there's simply going to be some groups of producers that value those types of things and maybe some that don't. In the end, you have innovation and adoption is simply not an easy process. Change is easy for some folks, but for most of us, much less so. And over my years in extension, I've run into some producers that really handle doing innovation reasonably easily, and others that are similarly more challenged by it. And I think doing some more intensive communication with those types of folks, across those types of folks, across the folks that are able to pull this off and do it successfully, what are some of their underlying characteristics? And if you're advising people about these types of things, if you've got a sample of folks that don't necessarily fit the categories that you need to make this work, then you know better for your education efforts. So again, I'm really interested in learning some more basic science. I think there'll be some good progress there, but it's also really encouraging to see the extension side and also the education side. What can be learned from the folks with which the education efforts are very successful? That's in my mind, that's going to be very interesting and certainly have an impact on kind of bottom lines of producers, and do they attempt to implement these types of programs or not. So really looking forward to it, and looking forward to some additional discussion on potential extension issues.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Stephen. So any questions, comments that you have before we break for coffee, virtual coffee? Okay, so no hands, no virtual hands. Okay, so yeah, let's break for coffee until, so we are right there at 5. So it's 15. Okay, so it's, yeah, so we are a little bit ahead of schedule. So until 3:30 for, yeah, we can go for half an hour. I think everybody's a bit. Hi, Eric, are you there?
You told me to run away, Juan.
So you'd like to lead a discussion on the extension? I think that'll be.
Yeah, so I guess, and there's already been some discussion in the chat between Rita and Jessica and myself. I think, at least from where I'm at, this project, meaning the entire project, I think one of the challenges is going to be kind of keeping the research, and I assume even to some degree the extent or the education, the education and the research, or the education and the extension caught up with the research. Other large groups that I've participated in, similar to this one, although not as big, that becomes kind of a challenge and in kind of keeping everything together. And so maybe we could talk about some ideas to try to facilitate better communication between, the research team and or the extension team, although I think some of this would even translate to the education team, but I'll let Kathy worry about that. And then also additional opportunities. Again, Rita had posted a couple of things in the chat about some potential overlap specifically with the youth education piece. So,
yeah.
And maybe we should start just to see if anybody has any questions or other clarifying, anything else that they want to clarify as we kick this off that we may not have addressed, or now that they've had time to think about it, they've got some additional questions. Or is it just almost 4 o'clock?
Yeah, and you, Stephen, had a comment that I think that is really, if you can bring that up.
Yeah, so Kathy both just asked a really good question. It's one I intended to address in my presentation. Currently, Kathy, most of the extension team outside of, well, Jessica's in Utah as well, is in Utah. However, this should be easily translated to the neighboring states, I think, without much trouble in terms of, presentations, the materials. And I think a lot of that would, again, depend on county agents in those surrounding states being interested in programming that may be relevant within their particular counties in the neighboring states. Do you have any other thoughts on that, Kathy? Any other ideas? Yeah, so it looks like she's got some.
Yeah, here I am.
There you are.
Yeah, I think it's all very exciting, and kind of my job at On Pasture has been to take science and really translate it into ways that anybody could try and adopt whatever's being done. So I think that people will find this really exciting. They like the idea of medicines in pastures. The public information side of me sees some real opportunities, and I try never to be my public affairs person, but what I've noticed about a lot of graziers is that they indulge in a lot of magical thinking. And I think that this is science that will speak to that magical thinking part of them, with the medicinal properties and the, all the additions of the legumes and the soil health and all those kinds of things. So what I want to do right now, and I've been taking notes already, is I would like to begin the process of making people aware of this kind of information, that this kind of work is going to be going on. And then as you find things out, begin the process of telling people about it. Because what I've noticed is it takes, it's the same reason Target runs the same ad over and over again. It takes multiple times for people to see it, for them to even begin to grasp it or think about it. And then the other thing that I wrote in the comments over there is that I've learned to break things down into small principles so that one principle a person in the Northeast can use it as well as a person in the West. And so I think that's another area that I could maybe participate in and especially use on pasture. And then the final thing I was going to say is, if people want free access to on pasture, you should send me an email, because I'm happy to give the whole group here free access to on pasture. It may not go with what you're looking at, but I can do that for you. So you can just send me an email at Kathy@onpasture.com and I can get that for you. So there you go. That's all.
Yeah, thank you, Kathy. I think that's exactly what you mentioned. Is one of my first slides, is trying to work in this feedback loop where you in advisory board helping us engage people and then also foster new ideas. And on pasture is it's ideal venue, I think, for all this that we've been discussing. So that's right there, this feedback loop I was showing you at the beginning of this meeting. So I think if we accomplish this, I think we are starting to put things together in a way that we can integrate all this research, extension, education in a fluid exchange of ideas, and that's that we are doing right now with, with Eric on extension and Kathy, these meetings and then, the same like Nina was mentioning in terms of keeping us on track. I think all these activities will help us try to meet that challenge that Eric is mentioning in terms of trying to create this as a living organism more than just compartments.
Juan, I think that is a very good venue, but certainly not the only one. I'd like to put Matt on the spot a little bit. I think I asked Juan if this would be doable in his mind, but maybe do some brainstorming with participants at the pasture or the grazing schools, try to get some, from the standpoint of getting producers interested in the project, get some cooperators, and then also get some feedback on potentially the scientific parameters and even economic parameters. I mean, I could see where producers would say, rotating cattle every month is no big deal, or rotating it, 5 times during the summer is 2 times too many. I mean, there's a couple of different directions that might go, but trying to get this project out in front of extension audiences I think is a big idea. And I'm with you 100% on what was advocated by the grazing schools, in that having that personal contact and having the one-on-one and going out in the field, that people remember that. I mean, and if you ask them for input, they'll often give it. And I say this kind of as for self-serving purpose. One of the harder things to do with a group is to get them to talk about what it costs to do things, or what it's worth to them to do things. And I think trying to get the project out in front of participants, potential cooperators, one of the things they need to be on the hook for is, hey, if you're going to cooperate with the project, you need to fill out a survey that says what you spend on seed and how much labor you have involved in going through this process.
I think those are some good points, Stephen.
I just think, one of the things that we've done, that I've worked with some groups, if you can get a small group of folks that are not competing with each other to sit down and work you through a budget, you can learn a lot more than you can learn what the innovative producers are doing to manage costs. And if you can get a group that's comfortable talking to each other to do that, it's very informative. It doesn't take very long, and you have a very good budget that explains what it really costs to participate in doing a particular activity, what it's worth to them. And it can be very productive, very quick. But they have to see it coming. You can't have a meeting and say, hey, let's talk about how much money you made last year. That just doesn't, I mean,
That's a non-starter.
Nobody's going to say a thing in that type of setting. But if you set things up with 3 or 4 meetings ahead of time, and then you have a smaller focus group or narrower group, then it can be very successful.
Well, and maybe Matt can speak a little bit to this, Stephen. There's an individual at Snow College that does quite a bit with farm finances, that actually gets into some of the producers' books and helps them look through that. And so there may be some data that's already available based on Jay's work. Matt, what do you think?
Yes. So it's the Farm Ranch Management Program run out of Snow College, and they do the books for ranchers in the area. And so, and they do an annual report every year. You're probably familiar with that program. And that is the way we get a lot of our financial information, through that program. It's anonymous, and they can print it up. So I think there is probably a way to work with him to get the information you need.
Then also Ryan Larson here at Utah State has done some of that as well, working on enterprise budgets and other things, but very good. There was something I wanted to circle back to from a previous comment. I hope you'll come to me. Emily, I saw your comment, and I'll get with you on that. I'm hopeful that, I know what it was I was going to mention is the cool part about working with Extension and the value of including county faculty specifically. They have meetings specific for county agents, especially here in the West. And so I think Matt and Randall can comment on this. Presentations at some of those meetings on this program early on may help to create some interest in the neighboring states, specific to other county agents in other states. And then maybe we can drum up some interest in the neighboring states that way. Matt, Randall, what do you think?
Yes, we have a regional extension program or where we all present on programs and research in the area, and we will get agents from Alaska all the way to Arizona and California to Colorado and everything in between to those meetings, and that is definitely a place we could present this project.
Thanks, Matt. So Rick Danver just put a comment in the chat, and I'm going to ask him to clarify that a little bit. Rick mentioned that involving practitioners early on as partners in this project, bringing practitioner knowledge has multiple benefits. So Rick, would this be, where we're kind of talking of this novel approach? Is this just to get them involved early on to think through some of the pitfalls of implementing this type of an approach, or what are you thinking specifically, Rick?
Partly what made me think of it was listening to Stephen talking about, involving. Quite often, it seems like if we just have a few practitioners involved early on, there's practical knowledge having to do with the economics, the logistics that are handy. Even just that, like the discussion before about how many pastures, how much rotation, things like that. And there's just if once they're bought in, it seems like that aids then in, I would think, an extension down the line. They're the ambassadors then if they start to see the benefits, then you've got peer-to-peer, more peer-to-peer knowledge going on.
And it doesn't mean you have to do exactly what the producer group sets up. If the producer group insists on few rotations And it really, and we learned through the science background that it takes more than that, then you know the main issue with adopting that type of technology. You've got to narrow your set of producers to somebody who can do exactly that. So I think it's really a two-way street. There needs to be, I really liked what we did early on today with the brainstorming on the basic science side, but let's run some of this stuff by producers to see if there's some things we can throw out, because what I heard discussed was more than a 5-year project early today, and Juan has disappeared on us, so he's not going to.
Well,
No,
Rick, to your point, one of the goals is to find a couple of producers that we can implement a small scale version of this with. So Juan and I will actually go visit with one producer on Monday. And the reason I find value to that, number one, is it gives us an incredible amount of credibility if we can take other producers to that ranch to show them what an application of this looks like.
Yeah.
Because I think this project specifically, that's one of the challenges, is helping people to actually conceptualize what we're actually proposing. It's more difficult to articulate than you would think. Juan and I have gone back and forth on this quite a bit, but so I think there's some real benefits into trying to find some places across the state or the region that we can implement it, on a smaller scale, maybe not quite the scale we'd expect on a research plot or research scale, just so we have something to show people to kind of give them an idea of what it is. Then they can talk to the producer and ask them what's good and bad about it, why it may or may not work for their operation. Because the reality is this won't work for every operation. So I think you have to show that the benefits of it, and even to Kathy's point, identifying principles that they can incorporate into their current operation as it's functioning, because there are a bazillion constraints that limit what a livestock producer can actually do oftentimes. Some of those are social and some of those are logistic, but.
No, I think you're right. I mean, if for example, these producers that, some guys try it out and they're running around telling everybody that they've got these renewable, nutrition supplements out there, and that they thought they've cut a fat hog. That sometimes makes it, as far as getting other people to adopt it, that may do more than anything you or I could say.
Well, and that's a lot of the conversations that Juan and I have had about the project specifically. I think this actually goes back to the first question that was asked this morning. Are these novel landscapes? Are we trying to kind of restore to some, previous landscape? I think most of the applications for me, from where I'm sitting, are in more of a novel landscape approach, where either, you have a landscape that's been seeded to, say, a crested wheatgrass or a forage that has some benefit, but at certain times of the year is incredibly low quality, or, and so can we add these islands to those? Well, and Rick and I have talked about the struggles with things like crested wheatgrass oftentimes, but can we add, these islands into that situation and really create some value, in extending a more productive part of that grazing season, reducing input costs from supplementation, et cetera. So those are some areas that I'm really interested in kind of expanding. Along with that, Matt, the grazing schools that we've done, and we've already incorporated quite a bit of legume technology, if you will, into a lot of those grazing school things. Matt's done a good job and has plots to demonstrate a lot of that, but this little bit different concept.
Yeah, and there's clearly a need, right, and as you mentioned, during our visits, with Eric and Matt, in terms of producers looking for, more protein into their landscapes, given that, that particularly now with climate change, that we are facing issues on, I know you saw those articles, right, that cows shrinking, right? The cows getting smaller because of that, the shortage of protein that is going to keep popping up with increases in temperature and changes in precipitation regimes. So that's something that is already here, and that's so I think there's a clear need. The issue is, well, how to articulate this into a program that with the minimum input, without saying, well, we need to revegetate the whole thing, but minimum input, trying to achieve the maximum output. That's kind of so, and I think that's where all I can see the economic, the extension, education and research really blend into something that is useful for producers, for the landscape, and asks really interesting questions from research, and also is really important to educate our next generation of land managers.
So Jay just turned his camera on. Jay, did you have something you wanted to add?
Well, you know, as a producer, I think that I have a lot of questions, even though I've sat through the meeting all the way today. I have, in the last 12 years, have done quite a bit of work and planted quite a bit of stuff. And so my concern, as we talked about forbs and those kind of things, in my elevation, that is, I have tried doing in my limited area of work with cows, grazing some of those areas at different times and how I use them. And I've really struggled whether I've just grazed some of those pastures in the fall, or whether I've grazed them in the spring, or whether I've grazed some in the summer. Nearly all the way through, my forbs have not persisted in those areas. And so as a producer, the thing I'm really concerned about is if you go to the expense of the islands and all those types of things, I really need to see how we're going to keep those forbs in the landscape, because on my situation, and it's been at about 6,500 feet, so they should have had adequate water to survive. And so those are some of the questions that as a producer, I would really want to look at. And then the other thing that I'm concerned about is we've done a lot of water work in the state, but we're a long ways away from having water enough to replicate even what's been done up in the Three Creeks area up on Deseret. I don't think we as a state can come up with the money to get the water into those types of situations that are happening there under the current system of what we're doing. And so I'm concerned about all those things.
Well, and Jay, you and I have talked about, you know, the water situation and grazing rotation specifically before. And I think, to your point, I think we have to approach this with a broad enough objective so that there's something for all the producers to take home, because not every situation is exactly the same, and we can't be incredibly prescriptive because it just won't work everywhere the same. So I think that is a challenge with these types of projects, of finding where they will work and how you mitigate the impacts and costs. In terms of your forbs, Jay, you're not alone. Generally speaking, forbs are the most difficult functional group to keep in a system, not just here, even in the Great Plains. And so there's some additional work that needs to be done in how we manage that forb resource. It's not as simple as just grazing management necessarily either. There's a disturbance regime that matters. And so I appreciate your input on those.
Yeah, those are big constraints for sure. Yeah.
Anything else, Jay?
No,
appreciate the meeting.
Agree, Rita, in terms of testimonials, that certainly helps create quite a bit of credibility. When you have producers that can speak to the relevance of what we're talking about. Jennifer, did you have a comment?
I did. I had a question. I wondered if the forbs are going out because they're more vulnerable to drought, or is it because they're overgrazed relative to the grasses?
Yes. I think it's multi-pronged, Jennifer. I think in my experience and some of the research I've been involved with, just given time, grasses tend to win that competitive battle. And so they'll push the forbs out, even without grazing on a landscape. In fact, the Conservation Reserve Program, or the CRP program for the NRCS, that's one of their biggest challenges, is keeping forbs in a system that's not even being grazed for the most part through those programs. So this struggle goes beyond just managing grazing. Drought factors in. Competitively, grasses usually tend to win that battle over the long haul. So,
well, I'm just asking because the forbs that we've used and legumes certainly are deep rooted, and so they should have access to water, a little more certainty to have access to water. I know the grasses are more aggressive in their, upper level rooting, but even if cattle aren't grazing, other animals are grazing, of course.
Yep. For sure. Brody, did you have a comment?
Yeah, just while we're talking about the point of getting forbs and legumes to persist, I just thinking of interseeding some of these species, some of them on the list, are kind of not as competitive as others, and there's a reason there's a short supply of them. In order to reduce the competition when they're seeded into an area, is there a plan to try to knock back the grasses, spray them out, and then seed in the forbs with that drill that I saw in your pictures, or I don't know, maybe that's just something still needs to be talked about.
I'll let Juan answer that question if he's still around.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that's what we did, just spraying, and so for sure it's and the same what we did with Medusa head, with these competitive weeds, trying to spray for weeds for sure more than once, in at different times of the year, even, in spring and then fall again, before preparing the seed bed for seeding. And that seems to really help, at least for grasses. We had managing the grazing on those grasses in the scablands led to really over 5. Now we have plots that are over almost 10 years old and still are persisting in those challenging landscapes. That's so I think that's you're completely right, in terms of pushing those grasses, doing that preparation of the before seeding. I think that's critical, and I think we did the same. I think Jennifer had more the details on that, but that's something that in those islands, I think we need to think about that for sure. Preparing the conditions in a much more careful way, even if it entails more investment, and that's something that Stephen will take a look at that. But even if it entails a lot of investment at the beginning, I think it's really worth it in terms of potential success of the seeding. Yeah, Jennifer, any more comments on that, or what you did in that plot that trying to push?
Well, we've gotten connected with some folks today who have experience with resource islands, with Forbes, and so on. And so these are questions that we can explore with folks that do have more experience. And Brody, I know that some of the plant materials on that list are not really the most competitive materials, and so we don't anticipate things performing equally well at all. We have a few things that we think we can we can rely on, and the rest of it is just like, let's see if we give them the nutrition and the mycorrhizae and the inoculant, what is their maximum capability, and then maybe if it's not that great, they have a role, but it's not as the major component of these islands. So I hope we're staying really open-minded about plant materials all the way through this, so that we can really make these work one way or another. But we're going to have a lot of things that we have to learn along the way, I think.
I agree.
Okay, does anybody else have anything else they want to add? Looks like we've had a few starting to drop off due to time constraints. I think it'll be good tomorrow as we finish up with the education and different things, then to start talking some specific logistics on how to integrate a lot of this. So Matt or Jessica, did you have any comments you wanted to end with?
I guess just the discussion today has really shifted my thinking about how we might proceed in the first couple of years with doing some of the social science research. As I mentioned when I was giving the presentation, that perhaps maybe we can find a group of producers like we've started to discuss right now, that we can sort of share some initial ideas with and get initial feedback, and continue to meet with those producers over the course of the project to share new findings once we have them, and sort of have a longitudinal assessment of what they're thinking about various constraints or opportunities with using these sort of foodscapes that are developed through the project, as opposed to, we initially were just thinking of going to the Sustainable Grazing Institute. But it seems like with where we will be at, in the first year and the second year of the project, perhaps we won't be asking the sort of questions I initially had envisioned. It might be that they're shifting a bit from my initial plans. But I do really like the idea of finding some sort of group that we can follow over time to continually talk with as the project continues to develop.
All right, Matt, any word of wisdom?
I don't think I have any wisdom, but I do like the discussion. I think we're coming from many different sides. There's so much to this project, and we could go so far. I think we need to focus on what we're really good at, what we can really make a difference in, and focus on that, and then add as we go. But I worry that we could, like they said, this could be a 20-year project trying to get everything done. So maybe a little focus would help us.
I actually think that's the most difficult part of some of this, is we don't have time or resources to kind of go over everything that's been discussed today. So we're gonna have to parse it down into what's manageable for sure. Okay, Juan.
I agree. Yeah, that's a great discussion. You know, a lot of food for thought. I think it's my brain is full. Like that's maybe the excuse. My brain is full. So yeah, I think that's. But you know, I completely agree. You know, we need to learn to walk before kind of running the marathon, right? So it's something that needs to be done in small steps, and I think these meetings also help a lot in this, trying to gain some, first we think big and then try to gain some focus. I think that moving in both directions. So that's great. Yeah, thank you for a great day. You know, that made me think a lot, and but it gets me even more excited. So I think that's hopefully you live with this very same feeling. So I'm then looking forward to continue tomorrow on this journey. I guess that's thank you for hanging on until this late in the afternoon.
Thank you.